Good afternoon. It's been a busy week. Haven't had a chance to record one of these in a while. So, I guess we can just kind of talk about what's been going on. Today I took a child sex abuse call. That was not fun. I don't know how detectives who work in that division deal with that stuff all the time. At the patrol level, we don't deal with it all the time, but sometimes things crop up and, I get to deal with it. So I'm real young kids and probably being abused by dad. Just ugly stuff, and then evidence like videos and photos that mom had kind of collected over the last couple months. So not fun. A couple days before that, I worked a 17-hour day. Did like a disturbance with a weapon, crazy naked guy, gratifying himself in a parking lot and chasing people around with some brass knuckles and a rock. That was interesting. Just weird world we live in, and all kinds of like just ugly memories like that kind of follow you around when you do this long enough. I had some friends from prior job that's kind of law enforcement adjacent. They deal with similar stuff, but just kind of telling them about what's going on and things that they deal with. It's like, wow, yeah, that sounds a lot like this part of town or that part of town where they're working. Portland's not the city it used to be. I reminisce with some people sometimes about growing up here, and back when even I was in high school, before I was 18, and going downtown late at night with friends and doing stuff and walking around on the streets, and nobody really worried about it. A little bit. There's still, cities have their dangerous parts, but not like now. Now, you wouldn't let kids wander around at night in Portland, especially with all the shootings. Which, surprise, surprise, shootings have gone up substantially, over the last year and a half, 2 years. And of course, local media, wants to just play it's anything but the defund movement that's causing it. Gosh, what else has been going on? I don't know. Just a lot of work, I guess. This isn't probably terribly interesting to talk about. I guess I could talk about some of the use of force stuff that's coming down the pike, maybe. There's a big push to change the reasonable or objective reasonableness standard for use of force to a necessary standard, which kind of comes with a lot of problems. For the uninitiated, force as it relates to law enforcement is governed by the Fourth Amendment. So if you're using any kind of force on somebody, whether it's to grab hold of them, put them in handcuffs, all the way up to shooting them, that's considered a seizure under the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment protects us from unreasonable search and seizure. And so the objective reasonableness standard came about because if you're going to search or seize someone by force, then it's got to be reasonable. And of course, the Fourth Amendment doesn't really illuminate what reasonable means. And so you've got case law or court decisions that have come down since then that interpret the law, right? The Constitution, that's what the courts do, especially the Supreme Court, and kind of made some definitions of what reasonableness is and articulates that objective reasonableness standard. And if you haven't read Graham v. Connor, that's kind of the primary landmark case that articulates objective reasonableness. And something called the Graham factors, which is kind of the basic elements of objective reasonableness. What was the severity of the crime at hand? Was the suspect an imminent danger to officers or others? Were they attempting to fight or flee, that sort of thing, as well as a variety of other factors that also play into the totality of the circumstances, or all the information known to the officers at the time when they were using force that makes it either objectively reasonable or unreasonable, right? But due to the political climate right now, there's a big push to change it from an objectively reasonable standard to a necessary standard. And if you think about the dictionary definition of necessary, I mean, it presupposes sort of a 20/20 hindsight that you really can't fairly hold an officer to in any use of force, right? Objective reasonableness is without the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, right? So what did you know at the moment you used it that made it either reasonable or not, rather than saying, was this ultimately necessary, right? For example, I responded to a call with a 9-year-old with a large kitchen knife. He had menaced his younger sister, and he was running around in the street, threatening people, and generally out of control, and it was a very dangerous situation for a very small person. And so I arrived, he sees me, he takes off running, and I mean, you really only have a few options in that situation. I mean, you can walk away from it, in which case, what are the ramifications of doing that, right? You walk away and that kid goes back to the house and stabs somebody, or somebody else comes across this kid and he's out of control and stabs them. Maybe somebody dies, so not optimal. You can tase him, right? So if you hit a 9-year-old with a taser, what's that going to do to them? I don't know. I mean, generally speaking, tasers are quite safe, but not recommended for use on people who aren't adults or who are pregnant or extremely frail or elderly, right? So, I mean, maybe he'd be okay, maybe not, right? Or you run up and grab kid with a large knife and maybe get stabbed, right? I mean, it only takes a few inches in a sensitive area to, inflict serious damage. If you hit an artery, like the femoral artery, which is kind of down around where a 9-year-old's going to be able to reach, you're bleeding out in a matter of, minutes to seconds, depending on how deeply that artery is ruptured, right? So no matter what you do in that situation, it's an ugly choice. Now, ultimately for me, in that situation, I decided I was not going to tase the 9-year-old, right? I didn't want to deal with the ramifications of what that would do. And I did the dangerous thing, right, and took what some said was an unreasonable risk to myself and ran up along 9-year-old who's sprinting with big kitchen knife in his hand, latched onto his arm. I don't even remember this part, but from what I'm told, I actually lifted him by the wrist into the air with one hand and then peeled the knife out of his other hand. I just remember locking onto his arm and trying to keep my arm locked out so he couldn't swing it at me and then try to control the knife, right? So it ended well, great. I was lucky that day. That's a story I haven't told my wife, and she'd probably be rather upset with me for putting myself in that situation. But ultimately I was there, I had to respond. I made the best decision I could given the circumstances. Fine. Now, that said, another officer on a different day presented with the same circumstances, it might have made a different choice. Maybe he tases him, right? Now, is it unreasonable to tase a 9-year-old in that situation? I mean, it's certainly not preferable. It's not an optimal outcome. But is it reasonable? Well, given the alternatives, I come to the conclusion, yes, right? I mean, it probably would have been reasonable. I mean, it's a imminent risk of serious injury or death, right? This kid's got a very dangerous weapon. I mean, he's out of control, and going hands-on with him is, extremely dangerous, even though he's 9. It doesn't, again, take much to inflict, mortal danger on you with a knife that size. It doesn't take a whole lot of pounds of pressure either, especially a 9-year-old gets a good swing at it. When I was 9, it was, pushing 100 pounds. I wasn't a small 9-year-old. This kid was maybe a little smaller than I was at that age, but regardless, that's not the decision I made, but another officer on a different day, given the same circumstances, might have made a different choice. Now, we can say, perhaps you disagree, but we can say that's objectively reasonable, right? Given all the options, that might have been a reasonable thing to do. Again, this is a dynamic situation. It's happening like this. You have a split second to decide, do I grab him? Do I tase him? Do I just let him go, right? So had somebody made that choice, we could say it's reasonable, but ultimately, with the benefit of hindsight, knowing how I handled it, you could easily question, well, was it necessary to tase that 9-year-old, right? Couldn't you just run up there and use your training and, pull some kind of kung fu or whatever and, disarm him? Aren't you trained to disarm people with knives? And I mean, the answer to those things are yes, you can do those things. But if the standard is it necessary, right? What you're saying is there's something else you could have tried that might have been, a lesser level of force. And why didn't you do that, right? And you can play those games all day with any situation, with any use of force. But in this situation, right, it's very clear, right? I mean, was it necessary to tase him? No. Right? You can't say that was necessary because clearly we've got another viable alternative, right? I proved it. You can wrestle the knife out of a 9-year-old's hands, right? And so we get into these games of second-guessing people's, decision-making ability. And again, right, violent, rapidly evolving situations where they have split seconds to make decisions. And so, you put yourself in a situation where you can do that with, say, a more significant use of force. Say, a shooting, or, some sort of fight, right, where somebody gets injured, right? And it doesn't matter how violent that person was, right? You think of, any of the examples where, officers have been attacked with deadly, dangerous weapons, have been shot at, been charged with knives. And you can say, well, is it really necessary to shoot them in those situations? Like, why didn't you try a lower level of force? Maybe that would have worked. And since you didn't try it and you don't know, then you really can't say that it was necessary to shoot them, right? All you can say is that it was, reasonable, right? But if reasonable is not the standard anymore, if it's necessary, then, basically we're at a situation where officers are bound by decision paralysis, right? I mean, unless you can try every conceivable option in the universe of all possible options, from, asking politely all the way up through actually shooting, then you can't say whether or not, what you did was necessary or not. And that's not a good situation to put your peacekeepers in, right? It's not a good situation to put someone who has to make those split-second decisions to then say on the back end, well, we're going to Sunday quarterback you to death now, right? We're going to pick apart your decision-making process and think of every conceivable way that you could have done this different. And if we can think of any conceivable way that you could have done this different that you didn't try, then we can't really say whether what you did was necessary or not. And if the standard is necessary and we can't prove that what you did was necessary, then what you did was unlawful. And now you're on the hook for some sort of, criminal misconduct, right? Official misconduct. Because you didn't, obey the guidelines, if the legal standard is, necessary force, right? And so that's how you get into this choice paralysis, right? How can you ask somebody to seek out deliberately and put themselves in the position of dealing with people who are threatening people with dangerous weapons, like happened a couple days ago with the guy with the rock, or with the 9-year-old? How can you ask somebody to take on that personal, criminal and civil liability, to say you're going to go, intervene and interact with people who are having violent outbursts with deadly or dangerous weapons, and be bound to a standard that says you must try all conceivable alternatives prior to using, deadly force, for example. Otherwise, we're going to hang you out to dry because you can't prove that what you did was actually necessary. At least that's my read on it. Now, if you want to say that necessary doesn't mean that, necessary means, well, whatever feasible options you have available to you at the time, well, then we don't really need to call it necessary, do we, right? Because, again, necessary means needed, right? Unavoidable, right? And the most optimal outcome, right? If what you're trying to say is, reasonable given all possible alternatives that you can articulate in a, split-second decision, like I said, let him go, tase him, or grab him, then what you're starting to describe is not a necessary standard, but an objectively reasonable one, right? And that's not how people make decisions, right? I mean, you can't in a split second break down, well, these are my options, and the most minimal level of force is probably this, because anything less than this is probably not feasible. So I'm going to try this first and see how that works, and then slowly escalate my level of force up to ultimate level of force, deadly force if I have to, right, to obtain a safe outcome. That's not how the decision-making process works in a violent, rapidly evolving situation. I mean, if you've got the luxury of distance and time and cover and additional resources, then sure, by all means, we will exhaust all possible alternatives and thoroughly document that we have exhausted all possible alternatives, and try to give people cooling down periods and create the circumstances for de-escalation, and allow people to comply at lower levels of force, rather than jumping immediately to tase the 9-year-old, right? It's the difference between a contained situation, where we have resources and time and distance and cover, to where we can negotiate with somebody, and again, that rapidly evolving situation. And so, I mean, because law enforcement takes so many efforts to try and create those more deliberate scenarios and slow things down and contain problems and address them meticulously, because we work so hard to create that, I think it creates the false impression in people's minds that we can get to an attainable necessary standard, and I don't see how that's feasible in a dynamic world where you have things just occur suddenly in front of you, and you have a number of viable, reasonable choices, but you're now gonna again put people in a situation to say, well, you on the back end you chose wrong, right? We think best practice is not that, it's this, and you, even though you were under stress and you made the best decision you could, and tried to be reasonable in your actions and handle the situation safely at the lowest level of force that you could, we don't think that's good enough, and so we're gonna throw you under the bus now. How long are people going to continue to work under those circumstances? I don't know. I don't think you can have law enforcement under those circumstances. I don't think the job functions under those parameters. You might have something else, something more akin to private security, people who show up after something has happened and document something for insurance purposes, and then what, right? And people worry so much about disproportionate outcomes, especially on the basis of race, and if folks who are disproportionately poor and lacking access to services and resources are not able to afford private security or something like that, then you exacerbate a problem that you're trying to fix, right? By heavily restricting when and how law enforcement can exercise decision-making ability on use of force. And you privatize the police to, the well-to-do, the wealthy, the powerful elites, and relegate the rest of society to, something more akin to, clan warfare and, resolving disputes, based on affinity groups or something like that. I mean, you talk about the, anarchy-communist version of, community safety patrols or something like that. And you end up with the CHAZ or the CHOP, right? The Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle. And I mean, they didn't have police, right? They kept the police out, but they had these, affinity groups that kind of formed security collectives, right? And were running around with guns and shot up a bunch of people trying to enforce the law or keep the peace. I don't know. All I know is that a bunch of people got shot up there, including a couple kids who were driving around in like a white SUV, and they got riddled with a couple hundred rounds. That's what you get when you hamstring the police and create a two-class system where people can either afford private security or end up fending for themselves, right? Or if things get so bad that you end up like, we need to, have private security for everyone, right? And have it be publicly funded, and have them specially trained to deal with violent situations, and equip them with the tools needed to deal with dangerous and violent people, and then even giving them authority under very specific circumstances to use force. And before you know it, you've gone and disbanded the police, created an unequal two-tiered system, and then reinvented the police to solve the problem that you created by defunding and disbanding the police, or some such. I don't know. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the subject. Let me know what you think. It's been fun. See you next time.